Hey everybody, Who's Your Jedi here with another review for you. This time I'm talking about episode 6 of season 2 of Young Justice called Bloodlines. This is another episode written by the esteemed comic book author and main writer for a good while of the actual Young Justice comics, Peter David. And again, this is another very, very good effort on his part. So let's jump right into the story here. This is our introduction to the character of Impulse. We have seen Impulse outside of the comics before. He was played uh, pretty well by Kyle Gallner on the Smallville TV show, and while I did enjoy that riff on the character, there was a lot of it that was changed from the way he was in the comics. Here we get to see Impulse genuinely as he is, more or less in the comics. And being a big fan of the Impulse comics when they were coming out back in the 90s, I really did enjoy that. So that said, I have to give a lot of props to the fellow who is playing Bart here. That is, of course, the esteemed voice actor Jason Marsden. He's got a really impressive resume. He was Chase Young on Shaolin Showdown. He was the voice of Craig Boone in Fallout New Vegas. If you were watching Teen Titans a few years back, you would recognize him as the voice of Billy Numerous. But to me, he will always be the character of Dash X from the old show Erie, Indiana. I know that that show has a special place in the heart of a lot of folks my age. It really was quite a kick in the pants, and I still have very fond memories of it all these years later. So anyway, we do get to see what is a very true to the comics version of Bart. Especially, actually, I'd say he's even somewhat toned down from how he was portrayed in his very early appearances. He was he was a very hyper sort of character when he was being written in the early days by his creator Mark Waid. And while this version of Impulse definitely doesn't need any more coffee, he was genuinely even worse in the comics. But Peter David does handle the story quite well. We get to see a lot of the goofier aspects of Bart's nature, his tendency to use a lot of future slang, something that he did a decent bit early on, and of course his habit of sometimes talking with other speedsters at super speed so that other folks around them could not understand them. That it just genuinely does remind me of a scene from one of the early issues of the Impulse comics. So I did very much enjoy that. But of course, when he shows up and goes to visit his ancestor, his grandfather's house, this is actually very, in some ways, reminiscent of what was to be an early draft of the classic Flash story, The Return of Barry Allen. But of course, that story ended up playing out differently in the comics, and Bart's story itself was also very different. In the comics, he came back to the past not as a tourist, but because he was born without the ability to really control his speed, and he was aging super fast. Here, Bart is recast. Well, at first, he does seem to be exactly what he says. He's just there in the past to have fun. And he's goofing around, talking with people, and inadvertently letting them know things about the future that he shouldn't. He takes a page out of River's Song from Doctor Who's book about talking about spoilers whenever he either goofs up or can't really reveal things that he knows. But as we see over the course of the episode, Bart is in fact lying. He is not some tourist who has accidentally become stuck. He has made a choice, very deliberate choice, to go and try and change the past for the better. Okay, sorry, I just briefly was flashing back to the theme song from Quantum Leap. But anyway, here, rather than just being the goofy tourist, here Bart is, let's call a spade a spade. He's John Connor. No, actually, no, it's not John Connor. He's Kyle Reese. I'm sorry. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, I am talking about the original Terminator movie from like 1985. Okay, so yeah, and in a way, he's actually the way this is set up. It also reminds me a lot of things that we saw if you've played it in the storyline for the game DC Universe Online, especially the way we see the devastated future Happy Harbor, very reminiscent of the devastated future Metropolis that we saw in that game. But anyway, I actually really do like this change to Bart. Before he was he was really just a goofball. He did have his problems. He did have his depth, but here it like I said, it is actually genuinely fair to kind of compare Bart to River's song now. He's someone who has come to where he is with an agenda. He has specific goals that he wants to accomplish, and he has knowledge of the future that could be very helpful, but for his own very good reasons, he cannot reveal this information to the people around him. And as we've seen at the very end of the episode, Bart is able to change the past, but he might not be able to change it enough. So this really does kind of bring me back to make me wonder something. Let me try that again. This does bring me back to something that I was talking about in my first review for this season, and that was that I kept wondering if maybe this wasn't all going to turn out to be some kind of story where ultimately everything would end up getting undone by time travel. And as the episodes have worn on and we've seen more and more of this new status quo, I've sort of just figured, okay, that's not going to happen. This really is going to be the new how it is from now on. But now looking at this, and especially what we saw at the very end of this episode, where it looks like Bart's efforts may in fact be doomed to fail, again, I'm starting to wonder if maybe my first instinct wasn't right. I can't but wonder, like, maybe things are. Now, do keep in mind, the Young Justice team now does indeed have a time machine sitting around their headquarters. So, is it really that hard to think that maybe we could get to see a riff on when we were watching the alien invasion the simulated alien invasion last season, where we were watching, or at least thought we were watching, all of these characters die. So, really, if that's where things are going, is it really so hard to think that maybe towards the end of the season, somebody else is going to end up going back in that, topping in that time machine, going even further back in time to where we last saw our heroes, and doing something that's going to alter the future that we saw, that we've been in already? Now, I'm a little. I have to wonder if this is something the writers would do, because if they do it, then I'm sure that a lot of fans would complain that this season or all these episodes that we've seen so far don't count because they ultimately get undone. And frankly, I think that's kind of a silly position to take. I mean, yes, the stories would essentially be erased from the timeline, but that doesn't erase the emotional investment that we've had in what's happened here, in that we have placed in getting to know these characters. It doesn't take away from the story, the fact that we've gotten so many very good stories, that we've gotten all this good acting, this good writing, this good drama. It just seems overly nitpicky, focusing too much on what is continuity. And while continuity is of course important, particularly in something like comics, which have so much history, which draw on their own continuity so much, at the end of the day, it's really all about storytelling, if you ask me. So it doesn't matter if the timeline ultimately becomes an alternate reality, becomes a possible future, gets erased from the timeline, whatever. If I got a good story out of spending time in that timeline, then I don't feel cheated. Now, if you disagree with that, if you feel differently, okay, that's fine. It's a free country. You're perfectly free to feel that way. But that's my point. I've made it. I'm going to leave it at that. So let's talk about one thing that I'm really kind of a little confused as to why it seems that Wally is just not as fast as Barry and Bart. I mean, he even needs help getting away, their help from getting away from the explosion. Now it could just be that he's out of practice as a speedster, but I can't help but wonder if maybe there's not more to it than that, and maybe that's why he decided to step away from the superhero life, focus on going to college, getting his education, focus on his relationship with Artemis. And I have to admit I was a little disappointed that we didn't get to see Bart making any sort of comments as to where the future, what future sort of future might lay in that direction for Artemis and Wally. But ultimately, that's really not particularly relevant right at that particular moment. So I can see why they didn't do that. But it wouldn't surprise me if that particular bit of information turned up in a future episode. So sticking with that side of things, one thing that I did enjoy was we do see basically for sure that in the Young Justice world, their version of Central City is indeed meant to be a riff on St. Louis. I mean, we see this big, you know, jumped up version of the St. Louis Arch. Now, granted, in the comics, it's even flat out been stated that Central City is in Missouri and that its sister city is across the Mississippi River in Kansas. This is, of course, Keystone City, which is where Wally West operated most recently in the comics. If I'm remembering my Flash comics right, they've actually moved it back over to Central City again now that Barry Allen is the Flash one more time. But I haven't hugely been keeping up with what's been going on in the comics lately in terms of Flash. So anyway, I did enjoy that. I do like it when they do show the cities of the DC universe being located in real places. Like for example, Gotham City in the Young Justice world is located apparently right about where New Haven, Connecticut should be. Now, I always had the impression that Gotham was actually located in New Jersey somewhere, and it was even shown to that Gotham was even shown to actually be in New Jersey on a driver's license in one comic that I read years ago. But you know what? That's not really relevant to what we're talking about right now. So let's talk about some other things. One thing that Peter David is, of course, known for is having a really good sense of humor and instilling that into his writing. And we do definitely get to see some really nicely humorous moments here. We get to see a shout out to the famed DC Comics creators Fox and Gardner. I'm sorry, I can't remember their first names off the top of my head, but their names are mentioned as the name of a street, I believe, in this episode. So I did enjoy that. We also, of course, got to see the really fun joke where Bart mentions that half the people at Comic Con are time travelers from the future, time tourists. I've been to Comic Con out in San Diego 3 times. If you love comics, if you're just a fan of geeky pop culture goings on, folks, it really is. Nothing else compares. Comic Con is fantastic. And there's always some very interesting folks just roaming around. So it wouldn't completely surprise me if there were a few time travelers mixing around with the crowd. Especially considering that I saw the guys from Gwar at Comic Con one year. So yeah, just gonna leave it at that. But anyway, let's continue talking about the writing here. And another thing that Peter David is very good at is he's very good at weaving the web in terms of storytelling. And then he will pull it tight on you when you least expect it. For example, the perfect example here is that when we see him in the very early parts of the episode, Bart keeps talking about crashing the mode and all this other stuff, and we just assume he's speaking in typical future teenager slang. But of course, and that's all we just write it off as that. But then when we get to see the interactions, the scenes with the aliens, and we see them talking about crashing the mode, that's when things start to feel ominous. This is when we first really start to get that there's more to Bart than what meets the eye. And of course, by the end of this episode, we see what crashing the mode can mean. And for Central City, the results of that are pretty devastating. And it looks like that this could genuinely be devastating for the entire world, given what we see by the end of the episode in the future. Now, another thing that I want to talk about is basically, let's look at the title of this season. And this season's subtitle, I guess you should call it, is Invasion. Now, I've talked with folks in the comments and in the private messages they sent me about whether or not they're going to be doing a riff on the classic DC Comics story from about 20 years ago that was simply called Invasion. Well, one of the things about superhero comics, of course, is that alien invasions are a pretty routine sort of thing. And Invasion, that particular story from 20 years ago, it's known, but it's not really one of the, I guess you could say, one of the stories of legend. It's not from the DC universe something like a death in the family from the Batman comics, or the death of Superman, or from the Teen Titans, the Judas Contract. One of those stories that just about everybody seems to know. However, when they mention the metagene in this episode, that's when things really start to click for me. Now, I don't want to talk too much about the storyline from the story Invasion in the comics, because if I do, I really feel that I might genuinely spoil some of the surprises that the creators of the show may have in store for the fans. So I don't want to do that to you guys. But I will say basically, and I'm pretty sure that you could probably figure this out from the episode alone, that the metagene is basically something that can give people superhuman powers. And that is exactly correct. It's the DC Comics version of the mutant gene, or the X Factor gene, that gives mutants in the Marvel universe their powers. Now, the metagene works a little bit differently than the X Factor gene in the comics. In Marvel Comics. You know what? We'll save the discussion on that for another time. I want to see a little bit more of the show before I talk about that, because again, I don't want to spoil anything that might really come as a big surprise to folks who are not familiar with the comics. But what I really can say is that having an understanding of that particular storyline from the comics, and then looking back on the things that we have seen since the start of this season, suddenly things really seem to make a lot more sense. A lot of the pieces, for me, have fallen into place. Now, granted, all I have is an idea of what I think is going to happen. And I could be completely wrong. And one of the reasons why I, obviously, besides not spoiling things for people, is that I just don't particularly like to make predictions or speculate too heavily about these sort of things online, because inevitably 90% of the time you end up being wrong. But yeah, if things are going the way that I think they might be going, then yeah, we're in for some stuff that's going to be really intense, folks. And it's, in any case, even if I'm wrong, I think we are going to be looking forward to a really spectacular season. But anyway, let's move on to our B plot with Cheshire and not Arsenal, Red Arrow. First of all, I have to point out that Roy was completely right in this, in saying to Cheshire, we should have left Leanne with your sister. Now, again, I cannot believe that as two skilled superhero / assassin, super people as skilled as Cheshire and Arsenal are going to break into a compound full of, trained martial arts killers while lugging around a baby which could start crying at any moment. The fact that they did this just makes them seem like complete and utter idiots. And I can forget, I can understand why characters in stories often make mistakes, but they need to be mistakes that are in character, that are believable. And this is not a believable mistake for these two characters would make. Doing this just makes them look like the biggest, not just the biggest idiots in the world, but the worst parents in the world. You do not take a baby into a fight with an army of assassins. But they did. So we do have, finally, we get to see once again the real, quote unquote, Roy Harper. He's back. And of course, we're going to see the impact of that next episode, which I'm definitely looking forward to. It really will be interesting, I think, to see what happens this, because if we do the math on this, then the real Roy would have been abducted something like, what, almost 10 years ago? I might not be doing the math on that right, but he's certainly in for a very, very big shock when he does revive. And that's definitely something to look forward to, folks. So overall, this is a really solid episode, and it definitely does expand the mythology in a lot of ways for what we are going to be looking at in terms of this season. And of course, we do seem to be getting some very, very heavy hints that we will be seeing a riff on the invasion storyline from the comics. And I gotta say, folks, that really does get me very excited. I have read a little bit of I do know the overall story. I have read a little bit of the comics from that time. They're pretty good. So I think if they take that story as the baseline, sort of update it to the modern sensibilities, give it the Young Justice makeover treatment that we have seen become so incredibly effective for characters like Sportsmaster and Mr. Twister, then I think we're just going to be in for something that is going to be absolutely fantastic superhero television. So anyway, folks, that's all I have for this episode. As always, please comment, rate, and subscribe. Naturally, you can follow me on Twitter as Who's Your Jedi. And until next time, take care and have a good one.